Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Testing Psychologist podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Jeremy Sharp, licensed psychologist, group practice owner, and private practice coach. Many of y'all know that I have been using therapy notes as our practice EHR for over 10 years now. I've looked at others, and I just keep coming back to therapy notes because they do it all. If you're interested in an EHR for your practice, you can get 2 free months of therapy notes by going to thetestingpsychologist.com/therapy notes and enter the code TESTING. This podcast is brought to you in part by PAR. Hey, guess what, y'all? The Brief A has been updated. The Brief 2A is the latest update to the Brief 2 family. Use the gold standard in executive functioning assessment to assess adult clients. You can pre-order it now. Visit parinc.com/products/BRIEF2A. Hey folks, welcome back to the podcast. Glad to be here. If you have been a listener for any number of years, you will know that I've had a few guests from the practice Thriving Minds, which is in Michigan. I started with their owner, Dr. Amy Kocherba, talking about selective mutism, and then talked with Bryce Hella about supervision and Andrea Roth about sleep. And now I have another of their employees, Katelyn Reed, talking about intensive treatment models. This is a fascinating conversation. It's a model that I don't think a lot of us probably adhere to, but after the conversation with Katelyn, it certainly got my wheels turning about what this might look like in practice. And I imagine it will do the same thing for you. So a little bit about Katelyn. She's a limited licensed psychologist and the selective mutism program director at Thriving Minds Family Services there in Michigan. Through her work there, she specializes in treating children with selective mutism via traditional weekly therapy and intensive therapy, as well as group therapy models. Katelyn is the current president of the Selective Mutism Association and co-author to the recent book, Selective Mutism, an Assessment and Intervention Guide for Therapists, Educators, and Parents, revised and updated edition. So there's a lot to take away from this. It is testing adjacent, I would say, but certainly relevant for a diagnosis that a lot of us work with quite a bit, or diagnoses, I should say, selective mutism and other anxiety-related disorders. So hope you enjoy this one. And without further ado, let's get to my conversation with Katelyn Reed. Katelyn, hey, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, thank you so much.
Thanks for being here. Yeah, it's funny. I feel like, I'm developing a pretty close relationship with your practice at this point, having had, let's see, maybe 4 of you now. Is that right?
I think I'm the 4th. Yeah,
Amy
that sounds
and
right.
Bryce and
Andrea.
Andrea, that's right. Yes, of course. The sleep episode. Mm-hmm. Yeah, y'all have a kind of star-studded staff up there. And I would imagine it's a pretty nice place to work.
It really is. Yes, absolutely.
So yeah, thanks for being here. We're going to be diving deep into this topic of intensive treatment options, which I think is super relevant for us and the diagnostic work that we do and different options for treatment for some of these kiddos. So before we get into it, I'll ask a question that I always ask, which is why this is important to you and why do you care about this and why have you chosen to spend most of your life on this?
Yeah, I guess maybe we should first define what intensive is, right? So intensive, the way that I usually explain it to the families that I work with, it's not called intensive because it's inherently harder, but just more time intensive. So instead of taking a typical course of CBT, which might be 16, 20 visits spread out once per week, we're usually squashing all of those sessions into the course of a couple of days or a couple of weeks. And so the intensive, the intensive offering, I think, brings a lot of clinical value, meaning we see a lot of kids make more substantial gains because we can thin out some of that warm-up window. We can connect families with more folks who have expertise in their child's condition. And so we can get better access, improve access to evidence-based interventions. So that's why I'm super passionate about it. And I work in a pretty niche area in treating selective mutism. So we get a lot of families who come from a pretty considerable distance to our clinic looking for that service. And so for us, it evolved in a really natural way. We had all these families who were saying, I can't logistically make this work to come every single week. It's going to be a 6-hour round trip thing for us. But yeah, it's really evolved beyond that point. So it's been pretty exciting to be a part of that.
Yeah, it is super exciting. I mean, I have a lot of questions about just the logistics and how all this works and that kind of thing. I'm curious just about your background. Like, did you start in a more traditional treatment model where you were doing the 16 to 20 session CBT thing or something similar? And
Definitely.
then,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yep. Definitely. And pretty broad background in terms of lots of different anxiety presentations, always from a CBT exposure based model. But then, yeah, the intensive model for us just came from the need of the families that we were working with. You know, we're working with families who were like, I have to hop on a plane. I cannot do the weekly sessions. And this was, of course, pre-SciPact, where it was a lot easier to work across state lines. So we were really finding we needed to be able to develop something that met the needs of those families.
right, right. Yeah, let's dive into that a little bit. I would love to hear more about just the practice setup, how this is integrated in the practice. I don't know if you were around when y'all made the leap the first time. Like I would imagine saying, "Hey, we're going to do this week of intensive treatment
Yeah,
and hopefully
it
people
was.
come." Like how do you take that leap? So any
Yeah.
questions around that material would be
Yeah,
great.
so we have several different intensive models that we offer at our clinic, and again, I've dug in a little bit to the research on what are some of the other folks out there doing because I don't want it to be, although my practice is primarily in SM, I realize that that's not going to be your entire audience's primary focus. I want to try to speak to what is appropriate for those conditions too. We offer 3 different treatment models for intensive models, for selective mutism. We also see school refusal. We've seen other more specific phobias with this model too. So it's something that we are growing more and more. And to answer your question about making that leap. So my primary role is doing intensive style treatment. And absolutely, the beginning, we would get, sort of more sporadic referrals for this. And so I would try to squeeze those families in around my other sessions. And what that meant is that I had just an insane amount of sessions that week.
Mhm.
I was doing 4 or 5 hour days for the intensive and then still having 3 or 4 hours for my other clients that I sort of felt like I couldn't take a break from that week or whatever. And even at the beginning, we were sharing our time. So they might work with me for the first 4 hours, and then they might see Dr. Cordoba, who you interviewed some time back, for the remaining 2. So initially, it was just however we could make it work schedule wise. And at some point, we were getting enough referrals that it made sense for my position to sort of evolve to that. So I don't see barely any regular traditional cases anymore. I do primarily intensive, and then I also do some testing.
Right. Nice. Nice. So as far as details around this, again, just very curious how this works. How many intensives are you doing across the course of the year? Is it multiple times? Is it a one-shot deal? What's this look like?
Yeah. So I would say it often is a one-shot deal. So I might work with a family. They'll come out for 4 consecutive days. We'll work for about 5 hours each day. And it's my hope through the intervention that not only is the kid getting the type of exposure opportunities that they need. So for treating selective mutism, that's talking to new people and in new places. And I should note that with the intensive model, we can really do the in vivo exposure, I think, in a more successful way. We have just more flexibility, right? If I have 5 hours, I can go to the park with the kid and we can practice talking to new children. And simultaneously, or just thereafter, we can go to the grocery store and practice asking for help locating items on our grocery list. And we can also go and order lunch together and practice ordering their meal in a full sentence. So I can really get the in vivo component pretty easily there. We're getting the kids as much practice as we can get in a short window of time, right? But we also want to equip the parents of the kids that come with the skills and strategies that they need to be able to replicate this. So because we're sort of targeting both exposure work with kid, parent training, parent practice, parent coaching, we're able to, for the most part, send kids away and they continue to keep up the exposure work that they've been taught. And we usually do some school training just because of the nature of this particular diagnosis. We want the educators and the administrators of the school to have a better grasp of the diagnosis and their role in supporting the intervention efforts. So yeah, when we can sort of provide that wraparound service, many folks have the foundation of what they need to be able to continue to implement it on their own.
Yeah.
Some do come back. And for us, that's often switching between our intensive models. So I referenced that we have 3 for SM alone. So we have folks who come to us for a clinic 1-to-1 intensive. So they work alone with me. We start in the clinic to establish speech, lay the foundation of our psychoeducation, do the assessment just of their symptom profile for SM. And then we progress into the community setting as well. We have another version where we come to the child specifically in their school environment, usually, and we carry out the same evidence-based interventions. And instead of training the parent, we're training the school or the school social worker, the teacher, whomever are the stakeholders there. And then we have a third model, which is our treatment camp. And in the camp, we rent out a school and we time it to the beginning of the school year. And the kids are in a group of other kids who are approximately their same age, and it's meant to replicate a school. So they're being called upon and asked to read aloud and speak in sort of school-like scenarios. So we might have someone who comes for a 1-to-1 clinic intensive because that's where they're at the beginning of their treatment. And then the following year, they come back for the camp because they had some good success and they really want the new school year to start off strong. So they sort of opt to come back and do that instead.
Yeah, I'm so interested in this school model. So when you say you rent a school, what does that mean? And how do you are there actors? How are you staffing the school? How are you replicating a school environment?
Yeah. So we literally rent out a school. So we reach out to a private school in our area, and we've have a sort of a standing relationship at this point with one school. And it's in the middle of the summer, or I should say the end of the summer. So we have to deal with some of their cleanup measures, but otherwise the school functions the way that we need it to. There's a lunchroom space, and there's a recess area, and there's a variety of classrooms and everything we need. Okay, so then in terms of staffing, this is the much more complicated question. So we have, if we think about a school, there are principals and there are teachers, and then there are sort of behavioral aides, right? So in the school, in our camp, there are directors or principals. Each classroom has a teacher. It's one of our licensed staff focusing on selective mutism. And then every child is paired 1-to-1 with a counselor. The counselors we recruit primarily from a local graduate school. students, mostly in psychology, some social work, some speech pathology, some in like special education programs. So things that are tangential to our pediatric anxiety world. And we train them, and then they carry out the intervention under sort of the supervision and support of all of the folks who are specialized, who are in the room at all times too.
Gotcha. This is fascinating. Fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we mentioned the school refusal program, the selective mutism. Are there
Mm-hmm.
others that you're doing in the practice or other presenting concerns that are more amenable to intensive treatment?
Yeah. So, like we acknowledge, the school refusal part came a little bit later for us. And I think originally we thought, well, we'll just take what's working for selective mutism and sort of make some minor tweaks and changes and roll it over to the school refusal population. And I think what we found is that the intensive model still worked well, but we needed to adjust a little bit more than anticipated, because if we just took 4 days and got the kid into the school for 4 consecutive days, that didn't necessarily mean that they were going to have the same success the subsequent week, right? So there's definitely tweaks and modifications from the different populations that we'll see. We are only using this with anxiety at this point in time, and that's really what the research has been conducted on, that I've been able to find. One of the things that is complicated about the research is that there's a variety of terms. So some are calling them brief, intensive, and concentrated, and some of them are calling them intensive group behavioral treatments. So there's a lot of different acronyms. But we're seeing this start to be used with not only selective mutism, social anxiety, school refusal, panic disorder, and some specific phobias, separation anxiety, certainly obsessive compulsive disorder, which is, if I'm not mistaken, where this whole thing started. Generalized anxiety disorder. So really a ton of utility with a pretty wide variety of populations.
Sure. Do we have research on, intensive versus typical once a week
Yep.
exposure? What's that look like?
Yep. So first of all, some of the research is, of course, we're comparing this intensive model to waitlist controls, or we're comparing them to, non-treatment receivers. Nothing. But we also do have head-to-head comparisons with intensive versus regular form CBT. And the research is really telling us that we see comparable gains, effectively no change in effect size from the traditional model of CBT, but that the gains might be achieved more quickly. Right. So if you take 20 sessions and you squeeze them into 1 week, well, then you're going to achieve more in that 1 week. Right. So we see some sort of extra benefits, that is like a return to more typical daily functioning in a quicker trajectory. We see actually some of the studies when there are comorbidities, we're seeing more reduction in the comorbid symptoms, right? So if there's comorbid depression, we're seeing sort of a change in that as well, even though that wasn't really the treatment target. The other thing, and this is out of the SM research specifically, is that we're doing immediate follow-up, right? So we're redoing some of the initial assessments immediately after they complete treatment. And we're seeing sort of nice gains. But then we also have been following up these same families 3-4 months later, and we're seeing even more substantial gains. So the families are learning, they are practicing, they are implementing, and the kid continues to make progress outside of the treatment, which is really exciting.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's the thing that we're always concerned about, is how these interventions endure and if they generalize. Yeah.
Yeah.
This is great. So let's get into more details around this whole process, right? So I'm curious, where are most of the referrals coming from at this point? Are they internal from your practice? Are they external from others in the city, state, country?
Hmm.
Where are these referrals coming from?
By and large, they are coming from other families that we've worked with already. So it's
Gotcha.
word of mouth in that way. And I think, again, the SM side of this, because there's sort of so few specialists, there's a lot of really like dedicated parent groups online, and folks are, I think, doing a really good job at trying to connect families to resources because they themselves struggle to find resources. So mostly we're getting the referrals in that way. But so for the SM side, but for the school refusal cases, I think we're getting more of those referrals from like the partnerships with schools that we have, sort of put into motion. And the school social workers are passing along these resources to us as a resource to these families.
That's fantastic. Okay. And then what happens once they get referred? Like I would imagine there are some kids who are a pretty good fit, some are probably not a good fit. Like this
Mhm.
just it feels like so far outside the typical referral stream
Yeah.
or selection process. And I would
Yeah.
imagine if you like, admit a kid, so to speak, or accept maybe, and
Hmm.
then
Hmm.
they're not a good fit, it's like even worse because you're
Hmm.
spending so much time with them. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Uh-huh.
Like,
Yeah.
how does
Yeah.
the selection process work?
It's really unique. And exactly that it's hard to predict what the sort of presentation is going to be like once the kid gets here. And because they're coming for such a long window of time and often from a really considerable distance, the stakes feel really high. Like you want I mean, we want all of our clients to have success, but when someone's put a lot of time, energy, and money into the service, the stakes feel higher.
Of course.
um, so we start all of our sort of anyone who expresses interest in an intensive, we start with a 15-minute screener call. And they give us a quick snapshot of their symptoms from the preliminary phone calls to our team, and then we talk them through benefits and potential difficulties with the intensive model. We write them an estimate for services, and I know we're sort of planning a little bit later to talk about some of the sort of unique costs and insurance
Hmm.
components to this too.
Hmm.
Um, but we write them an estimate for the services, and we talk a little bit about what types of treatment goals are most appropriate. And that helps us to narrow into either this is a good fit, or, I think we need to try something else first before you can consider an intensive. And sometimes this has to do with their symptom profile or the severity of their symptoms, but sometimes not. And what I mean by that is like there are kids for whom they look incredibly, air quotes here, severe on paper, right? The behavioral questionnaires that we give show effectively no communication with anybody outside of their family. Um, and and we get them here and they're incredibly responsive to intervention. They speak with me or my colleagues relatively quickly. And there are other kids who look mild, air quotes again, on paper, and are slower responders. So it is really hard. And because clinically you have to make very fast decisions about the treatment that you're providing. You don't really get a few days or a week in between sessions to plan what's coming next. It sort of all does make for it to be a little bit more complex, trying to find who is the right fit and why. So yeah, so even kids who sort of sound more severe could be a good fit. And in fact, if we look back at the sort of key tenet of prolonged exposure, giving someone the long enough of a window that they need to fully engage in the exposure and feel some of that reduction in anxiety, such that they're able to sort of check that little progression off their list, sometimes these are kids who really need the 4 or 5 hours in one sitting to finally get to a place where they can have success speaking with a clinician. And they have not made success at home or gains at home, even with CBT clinicians, specialists in SM, because the session windows themselves are too short. So yeah, it's hard, but we want to get them on the phone calls. We want to get a sense from the families on what types of things the family is struggling with right now, and also what the family's knowledge itself looks like. Referring to effectively, have they already gone through some treatment? Do the parents understand more of the diagnosis and some of the treatment strategies, or are they fresh and really are hoping to get an immersive experience for themselves too?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you do the 15-minute screening, you figure out, and you said there is some component there of deciding if someone is a good fit for individual versus group.
Yep, exactly.
Talk me through
Yeah.
that.
So, and again, in clinic, school, where we come to the child's school or they come to our group, and that also takes place, outside of our office in the school, but here in Michigan. So effectively, if we are concerned that it's going to take, more than a couple of hours for the child to establish speech with our clinical team, then they probably are not going to be the great fit for the group model. So our camp, like many camps focusing on selective mutism, we have lead-in requirements, meaning we want to meet the kid before the camp starts officially. So usually they come out a day or two before. We meet with them and we establish speech with them. And we want the kid to speak at least one word to myself, let's say, and that one-to-one counselor that we pair them with, so that we know some of those hierarchy levels have been checked off before we throw them into this group. And they have to speak to their counselor around, 8 or so other kids and 8 or so other counselors, and they're being called upon in a group, and the demands and the hierarchy steps become just much more challenging. So if we're concerned that the kid's not going to speak at that window of time, then we might say, what an intensive that takes place one-to-one in our clinic would be a better fit. But there might also be times where, we have a kid who is doing really well with their home clinician, and they're starting to speak in community situations, and they're having more success with that within their extended family. And yeah, things are moving along, but in everywhere except the school. And at that point, we might say, hey, we can come to your school, or you can come to our sort of replicated school, where we can give you the talking scenarios that sort of meet the kids' current needs. So yeah, it's really a lot about like what exposure opportunities do they need, and yeah, how quickly do we think they'll be prepared for some of the more advanced goals.
Gotcha. Okay. I would imagine there have been situations where you maybe made the wrong choice for whatever reason. When you missed it. Yeah, in the good direction or the not so good direction. Right?
100%. Yeah. Well, and from a good direction, if we have someone who we expect is going to be, more challenging to work with, but they make really substantial gains, it doesn't really, I guess that's not so bad of a situation. And really we can adapt and adjust to that pretty easily. So we can find much more challenging goals we can adjust to that really easily. It's harder when we sort of overshoot what we think the kid is capable of, and then they have a harder time in whatever program, than we expected.
Sure. That does make sense. Okay. So let's see. Let's talk more about, I guess, the pre-treatment part. I would love to hear more about how you prepare the families for this experience. Yeah, just what that looks like, what you're telling them, how much are you sort of couching the, I don't know, anticipated effects or results?
Mhm.
I don't know. I just have so many questions about how to prepare families for this experience,
Mhm.
because I would imagine they build up pretty high expectations for something like this, and I'm curious how
Yes
you
and
address that
no.
specifically.
I'm always interested at how many families that I work with who are baffled that one of the comments that I hear frequently is, I thought I was going to have flown all this way and my kid wasn't going to talk for 4 days, right? That's a really common sentiment. So I think, yes, they're sort of cautiously optimistic and, willing to put some money and time on the line to make that bet. But I think they're generally, quite worried that the kid is not going to make really good gains. So there's some setup that I think we like to talk through for the family. What to expect. So for us, that sort of means we go through a day by day. So on day one, you're going to arrive. I will sort of direct you right away into our playroom space. There's a camera system set up in there. I'm just trying to get a language sample of what your kid can do alone in my office, but with you as parent. I want to see what their language looks like at baseline so that I have a sense of where I'm starting, right? And what I'm starting with from a treatment, strategy perspective. And so that's what the direct observation portion is going to look like. After that, we'll sit down, me and you, parents. We're going to talk about your observations, my observations, what those mean for treatment. We're going to set some, more defined goals together. I'm going to ask some additional questions about the paperwork that you shared in advance and your kid's symptom profile. And then usually we take a break for lunch. And when you come back, the rest of that afternoon, we're typically focused on those early exposure goals of, in my practice, establishing speech with me. And then I want to give your kids some psychoeducation about why we are going to be asking them to do these things. Um,
Hmm.
and some families find that they need a little bit more information for the kid. So I've
Hmm.
made a couple of social stories that they can sort of pass along and edit and adjust to their, like, we're gonna go and we're gonna go to Michigan, are we gonna fly or are we gonna drive? And they sort of draw it out on their pictures. Or we're going to be earning prizes for working hard on being brave. Here's some prizes that I would like to earn. So they can sort of work on that together. That we're going to meet Miss Katelyn. She's going to help us be brave. We're going to get to practice in different places. Where are some places that I want to practice? So that's some of the education that the families will give to the kids. And education for the families is incredibly important. And as we've built this out more and more, um, we've really found that we don't want families to come sort of totally novel. Because it's really hard to establish speech with a kid who doesn't talk to new
Hmm.
people,
Hmm.
unless we can sort of like keep them talking to someone that they do speak with, right? So
Hmm.
if we can keep them talking to their parent, then we have an easier way of edging into that interaction. That's a more comfortable exposure hierarchy for many kids than having to start from the ground up and work on saying sounds and doing all these things with an unfamiliar person. And so we do need parents to be. I certainly don't expect them to be like expert level clinician, but I do hope that they have some preliminary information. And so because of that, we created like a little video bundle that helps prepare the families for the experience. So there's like an introductory video that describes the condition and the basics of our intervention. There are videos illustrating us demonstrating the strategies that we've gone through and sort of coded. So at the bottom, the family can see, oh, they asked this question and here's why. And they waited 5 seconds for the kid to produce a verbal response so they can see the strategies sort of live. But we also have videos of us doing things wrong. so that they can go through and sort of make a point to be thinking critically about the types of questions they're going to be asking again, and how to sort of elicit speech. So since we started doing that, I have certainly found that the families come a little bit better prepared for what their role is in supporting things, and also, more realistic expectations of this is what my kid might be capable of. Of course, it varies from child to child.
Of course. Of course. Okay. Okay. Yeah, this is so nice to just hear actual details, concrete details about how you tackle some of these things with families. As far as the kids, I mean, you mentioned the social stories and, some info around that. I feel like I have to ask, like, how often it seems like it'd be hard to convince a child to participate in something like this, you know, having had a daughter who had some school refusal and now is working through some OCD-ish kinds of stuff. Like, I know firsthand, like, getting kids to engage in exposure is challenging sometimes. And so I'm just, how do you talk to the kids and how do you navigate if they like get there and then don't want to do it? What's that whole process look like?
That is definitely tricky. And that's one of the things that I think is discussed a lot in the research, is like how palatable is this to families, and specifically this like intensive, like, I'm doing this, I'm committing to this. Like, I don't have to just like try 1 or 2 sessions and see how I feel about it and I can just continue, right? Like, we're committing to this several day long experience. So the short answer is we try really hard to sort of couch these practices into things that are really enjoyable and really fun. So and then there's a reward system in place as well. And I think it varies substantially depending on the age of the kid. So the young kids, again, a social story tends to go a long way. And honestly, the younger children, you can sort of, if you do it well, you can get them through the first couple of exposures before they kind of even realize that they're doing exposure. And then you can do the psychoeducation. You can sort of say, like, I'm wondering, on a scale of 1 to 5, how hard you thought it was going to be to talk to me today. And how hard is it actually? And usually they'll report a reduction, right? From 4 to 2 or whatever. And so you're able to say, like, look, you've already done it. And oh my gosh, I'm so proud of you. You're already starting to see how this is working, right? Now, the older ones, we do provide some additional details too. Obviously parents are the consent providers, but we do provide sort of a written assent document that describes, here's what exposure therapy is, here's why we're asking you to do this, here's what it's going to look like, here's your role, here's your parents' roles, and we want you to sort of do your best. That's all we can ask of you. And we are also going to, as anybody who does exposure work would tell you, we're going to make sure that we're not asking you to do the things that are too hard. We're going to have an appropriate plan B or plan C at the ready.
Yeah, that makes sense. This is good work. So, okay, so they've gotten there, they're going through the whole thing. You did talk a bit about like how parents are involved. Can you say any more about like what are parents doing during these 4 days that kids are hanging?
Yeah. So we need them for the exposure, right? So we need them to establish speech. But then, like I said, these are predominantly families who live pretty far from us, so we're not able to see them on a regular basis. So we do want the parents to learn the strategy. So typically the week sort of starts where I'm at the helm. I am leading the exposures and I am coaching parents and telling them why I'm doing what I'm doing. And we always save some time at the end of every day, usually for a parent debrief. We talk about what went well, what didn't go so well, set plans and goals for the next day, et cetera. And then we are also as the week progresses, the intention is to hand more and more over to the parents. To say, okay, we're going to go to the grocery store next. Here's the grocery list. The first two employees that we talk to, I want you to tell them this, this, and this. And the kids, exposure goal is to say da 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 da, right? And so we want to be able to hand more of the exposure work over to the parents, so that one, the family feels more competent in carrying this out, but two, that the kid doesn't leave the intensive week thinking, I only do that for this clinician, or only because I was in Michigan. We really want them to see the continuity as well.
Okay. That's fair. Mm-hmm. Let's see. Gosh, what else? There's so many details. What am I missing? Oh, what about the age range? I've actually wondered about that throughout our conversation. What kids are appropriate for this kind of thing? Let's take a break to hear from our featured partner. Y'all know that the Brief 2 has long been established as one of the leading forms for measuring executive functioning in children. Now comes the latest addition to the Brief 2 family, the Brief 2A. This update will allow you to use the gold standard in executive functioning to assess adult clients. And you don't have to wait. It's available for pre-order right now. Learn more at parinc.com/products/BRIEF2A. Y'all know that I love therapy notes, but I am not the only one. They have a 4.9 out of 5-star rating on trustpilot.com and Google, which makes them the #1 rated electronic health record system available for mental health folks today. They make billing, scheduling, note-taking, and telehealth all incredibly easy. They also offer custom forms that you can send through the portal. For all the prescribers out there, Therapy Notes is proudly offering e-prescribe as well. And maybe the most important thing for me is that they have live telephone support 7 days a week, so you can actually talk to a real person in a timely manner. If you're trying to switch from another EHR, the transition is incredibly easy. They'll import your demographic data free of charge, so you can get going right away. So if you're curious, or you want to switch, or you need a new EHR, try Therapy Notes for 2 months, absolutely free. You can go to thetestingpsychologist.com/therapy notes and enter the code TESTING. Again, totally free, no strings attached. Check it out and see why everyone is switching to Therapy Notes. Let's get back to the podcast.
So that's a great question. So we start with relatively young kids. I mean, I work with, actually, I have a kid right now who I'm going to their daycare next week who had just turned 3. So quite young children. And for SM specifically, we need the kid to be in a school-like environment for at least 1 month before they can get the diagnosis. So yeah, that sort of limits things, right? We're generally not working with 1 and 2-year-olds as a result of that. And then we work with teens. We work with teens as well. And some even young adults whose sort of symptoms negatively impact them in the community setting, but they understand what treatment looks like and are committed to it. Really wide range.
Cool. That sounds good.
Most are sort of early school aged, though, I would say, is our primary. Just that's when symptoms are usually first apparent. And, it's hard for teachers to assess these kids' skills. And so there's sort of a lot of motivation to figure out how to support them more.
Right. Okay. So we've hinted at the billing process a little bit. I am really curious about that, just the logistics, how this works. Is there insurance involved? Is there not insurance involved?
Yeah.
What does that
We
look
take
like?
insurance. And we're very clear to the families that we work with that insurance will cover some, but not all, of the service fees. And that's because we're still using the same 60-minute treatment codes that we're not like a hospitalization setting. We're an outpatient clinic. And so we're using the same regular treatment codes that I'm guessing everybody else in this audience uses as well. And And we do, intake codes, and we do some of the assessment codes for the direct observation time, and we write a report for them as well. So we're using those codes too. So often how it works is because day one is primarily the assessment piece. We're able to get most of day one covered from their insurance, if they have an insurance that we participate with.
Mm-hmm.
And then usually beyond that, it's one treatment hour of the 4 or 5, and then the rest is patient responsibility.
Hmm.
Yeah, and I certainly wish that would change, because I think we know from the research that prolonged exposure is really important and really necessary for some clients. And again, we've got a growing sort of research base to suggest that this intensive model is equally effective, but sort of less, interferes less with families' lives and schedules, and yet that's just not really the reality of the billing right now.
Sure, sure. And I imagine that you're talking with families about this ahead of time to
Mm-hmm.
make sure they're educated and know what to
Correct. Yeah, and we
expect.
give them an estimate that says, here's what we found that your insurance will cover. You have a whatever percent copay or co-insurance or whatever. So we give them a pretty close as we can get
Hmm.
estimate to what their portion will be.
Yeah.
And then in order to be able to book their intensive time, we will they put a deposit down, right? Because of course we're reserving 20 something hours worth of time for a family at a window of time. So,
Hmm.
so they put down a deposit, and then again, we account for what we expect their insurance will pay.
Right, right. So yeah, that gets into questions about like no-show fees or cancel. Like, what if somebody gets sick at the last minute? How do you handle
Yeah.
something like that with when you've got 20 hours reserved?
Yeah. I was doing this at the beginning of COVID too. And so we did
Oh my
have to
gosh.
yeah, it was a whole thing. So, absolutely. If someone was sick or had an exposure, right, we had to have a pivot plan, which really at that time was, we will let you reschedule X amount of times, and then otherwise, right, like, please don't let us get to that point, and hopefully we don't get to that point, and we thankfully didn't. We have had kids who, the family emails us frantically the weekend that they were supposed to fly out, saying our service starts on Monday and my kid is throwing up, and we're not going to be getting on a plane. So yeah, so that's happened, and we try to be flexible with that. I mean, there are things that happen. It is really hard, from the clinician's perspective, right? Because if someone has a no show for their one session because the kid is sick, right? Like, you still have your full caseload the rest of the day. You're still making money. You still have things to do.
Sure.
You're not paying
Sure.
for child's care that you don't end up using, right? But yeah, it's a little harder with the intensive
Absolutely.
in that way.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, it's challenging.
Doesn't
Let's
happen too
see.
frequently, though.
Okay. Okay. Fair enough. Fair enough.
Mhm.
Did you have to do any unique or direct or specific conversations with insurance panels to get permission, quote unquote, to bill all of these non-covered hours, or it's just that's just the deal? I mean, we kind of know insurance panels do not cover multiple treatment
Yeah,
sessions
yeah,
per day.
correct. And so no, but I mean, effectively, they don't. We just the how we write the estimate is that these are just we can't submit these to your insurance. This X amount of time is just not billable. Or in our camp, right? There are some of the service fees that are like, we rent out this space, we have to train other clinicians, right? We have to buy the materials, to be able to provide rewards every day for all of these kids. So there are just some service fees that are just never going to be sent to insurance. The insurance doesn't even know they exist effectively.
Gotcha.
And then some families are able to, let's say we're out of network with their particular insurance provider, they will seek reimbursement, and they'll ask us for documentation to support that as well.
Sure. Sure. Of course. What about
Mhm.
I guess, personal side of this. I'm just thinking like times in the past, like when I've done in-person events or sort of multi-day events where you're kind of on for most of the day. How does one handle the emotional side, like managing your
Mhm.
energy, preparing? What's that look like?
Mhm. Yes, that is tricky. Yeah. So first of all, it was a lot harder at the beginning when I didn't have my schedule sort of dedicated in this way. Because if I was seeing other clients or leaving the camp and trying to go back and do an intake for something else that I had the next week, like it is incredibly hard to sort of keep up your energy and momentum, and sort of like the sharpness clinically,
Hmm.
all that window of time. But I think, now, because that's pretty much all I'm doing in a single day. Yeah, I don't find that it's much different from my other colleagues who might see 5 or 6 clients in one day. I'm just seeing the same client for 5 or 6 hours, right? So I don't find that part now is much more complicated. What is sometimes hard is, so the intensive format lends itself pretty naturally to people wanting to come during times where their kids are off school. They have more flexibility scheduling wise. So in the summer, I might have back to back to back intensive weeks. And, that is tough to be on it for so many weeks in a row.
Hmm.
When you're writing a report for each of these kids and you're having to still score all their questionnaires, and, like, just as much as we want the families to prepare for their time to make it as effective as we can make it, I as clinician need to be pretty well versed on this kid before they arrive in my office. So that's tough, trying to keep over several weeks.
Yeah, yeah, of course. Of course. I mean, I would imagine hopefully you have some flexibility to say, hey, I'm only going to do 3 of these this
Yeah.
summer or something like that.
Yeah, correct. I do try to, and I do try to schedule my time in that way. And then, yeah, because each of these intensives, like I said, we do a school consultation after they return home and are settled as well. I really have to budget some time, even in the summer, for flexibility to schedule those types of follow-ups as well.
Of course. Of course. Are there
Mhm.
other, I don't know if you'd say downsides, but just challenges, again, from more of a personal, just energy management standpoint or emotional standpoint with a model like this, things that are tougher to manage just for you as a clinician?
Hmm. Yeah. So one of the things is like the pivoting for the plan Bs and the plan Cs, if things don't go the way that you expect. And what's nice about this model with selective mutism in specific is that I can tell pretty readily if what I'm doing is effective, because the kid is talking or they are not talking, right? So the exposure, I see pretty quick results from the exposure, which gives me the chance to pivot my strategy pretty fast if I need to. Um, but on the other hand, yeah, you really do, like, kids are kids. And so sometimes they wake up cranky, or they had a tough exposure earlier and they're, feeling sleepy now. And one sort of thing that goes wrong can really set the whole day back, right? Like, it can
Mm,
really be a problem. Now, on the other hand, and this is why I love intensive format, if a kid has 5 successful practices in a row, we can usually get them to do a sixth practice, because what's a sixth practice if I've just talked to 5 new people, or like, let's say it's a separation anxiety case, we just did that practice and that practice and that practice. I can do this much harder practice for a longer window of time away from my parents, or from a further distance away from my parents, or whatever the exposure task is, because I've already had all this success. Um, but yeah, if things aren't going great on one day, it almost feels like the whole day can go downhill pretty fast.
Yeah, I think that'd be pretty tough. I mean, I think, have all struggled with that. Like, even if we're testing a kid and hanging out for, 4, 5, 6 hours
Yes.
a day and something goes wrong in the morning and it's like, oh no. And
Yeah.
you just buckle up and pull out
Yeah,
all the
and I
tricks
think
and hope that,
yeah, I think in some ways that's why there are so many parallels to the sort of testing role and this intensive role, like schedule wise. We're talking about a lot of the same variables, how much
yeah,
time you're allocating for these cases, which hours you're working with these kids, right?
yeah,
So I think that it's a nice sort of companion for folks who do a lot of testing, but maybe and want to have some treatment cases, but maybe don't have the bandwidth in their schedule to do that on a regular basis.
sure, sure. That makes sense. So that might be a nice segue just into, if folks out there wanted to, I'm about to say give it a shot. This doesn't seem like a thing you just sort of like give it a shot. Like, there's a lot of
Yeah.
planning and organization. But I mean, can you identify even like 2, 3 steps to take if somebody is
Hmm.
listening and they're like, I want to do this. How do I do this?
Hmm. Yeah. So again, I'm talking pretty exclusively about exposure therapy
Hmm.
and specifically about anxiety work. So obviously step number one is, having the competence in that. But I also think, like I said, our treatment camp, we draw upon mostly psychology students, but we definitely have providers who are already licensed and practicing and looking to get more experience with the intensive model or selective mutism specifically. And they'll come and do the camp. They're paired with a kid. And so that's a great way to get a feel for the intensive model and also to do it sort of with the guidance and support of our team.
Hmm.
That's one. And then I definitely, this is more applicable for the folks who are somewhat in proximity to our clinic, but we have a lot of folks who come in and shadow for the day or for a couple of days, which is a mutually beneficial situation, right? They get the sort of learning experience that they were hoping for. They get to participate in the intensive and see sort of all of the various components, the parent education and the coaching and the skills themselves. And I get another person for this kid to practice with that I need as well. So yeah, I think that is probably the most effective way to do it.
Nice. Nice. We should have talked about this at the beginning, but what is the role of assessment in this whole process?
Hmm. So we're not doing, really structured assessments in the way that we would for, ADHD or autism or things of that nature. It's more of, does this seem like a good, clinical fit for their needs? And
Hmm.
yeah, like I said, we're doing a lot of behavioral questionnaires. Some of them are, broad anxiety screeners. Some are much more narrow into the selective mutism symptoms. Some are things that we've sort of made ourselves that are just like, I find myself asking the same question about, will your kids speak to this person in front of other people, only alone? Do they whisper? Right. So more of like check the box sort of scenarios. Um,
Yes.
so all of that can be really helpful. With the older kids, we'll give examples of like suds hierarchies sort of scenarios, and we'll ask them to help us to arrange them. So as much as we can do at the onset to prepare for the treatment, the better. Um, we have had kids who end up doing more comprehensive testing with us as well. So they come in for the SM treatment, and then we find either through the intensive treatment or sort of post that there are also indicators of ADHD or autism or whatever else. And there's a concern about whether the child will speak with the clinician to be able to
Sure.
do the evaluation procedures. So sometimes they'll come back to us because they were already able to have success verbalizing with us. But yeah, generally it's more of the direct observation and behavioral questionnaires.
Yeah, yeah, that sounds good. I know we talked about the referrals and where the referrals are coming from. It sounds like it's a lot of word of mouth, which is great.
Mm-hmm.
Are there other ways that y'all are actively marketing this service and getting those referrals
Mm-hmm.
through the door?
Yeah. So we're a part of some of the organizations that sort of support CBT and other evidence-based practices, and that's something that we spend a lot of time collaborating. We speak at um, uh, conferences and trainings and such like that. We do a lot of collaborating with local schools and pediatricians, things of that nature as well. But yeah,
Hmm.
most of the referrals are coming from other families that we're working with,
Yeah,
and sort of dedicated groups focusing on XYZ diagnosis.
sure, sure. Yeah, I would imagine once the ball gets rolling with something like this and people hear about
Hmm.
it, then it gains steam pretty quickly.
Hmm.
Do you
Yep.
have any sense of, yeah, how many of these programs are out there in our country, at least?
Oh, that's a really good question. And at one point, I did have, so I'm a part of the Selective Mutism Association, and
Hmm.
there are a number of group treatment camps. And at one point, I had a list of all of those, and of course, I don't know those numbers off the top of my head now.
Yeah.
But yeah, they're sort of spread out, and of course, that's me sort of being naive about the sort of other areas of expertise, right? If you're doing more OCD intensive work or panic disorder intensive work, I don't pretend to know all of those groups either. I think that it's more rare, but also even in the last 10 or so years that I've been doing this, it is like exponentially growing. Um, yeah, so many families,
That makes sense.
and for the reasons that we started this discussion with, right? Like families are having trouble finding a provider that does evidence-based intervention and that has a specialty in their area of focus, it's hard for them to get to regular treatment sessions, or the regular treatment sessions are limited by some of the rules of the sort of confines of that setting. If you only have 1 hour, it's pretty hard to go out into any real life places to practice. Um,
Of course.
so yeah, they're definitely increasing. And like we said, with the research saying that it's equally effective, and then sometimes having sort of extra benefits that the families and the kids are endorsing, like I wouldn't be surprised if it continues to grow.
Sure, sure. Yeah, let's see. I had one more question for you around this, but now it's escaping me. Oh,
It happens. Mm-hmm.
thanks. Thanks. It's validating. Yeah, let's see. We have talked about a lot of things. We talked about a lot of things with this method of treatment. It's really fascinating. I mean, I love the idea. I love the idea of just diving in there and doing such intensive treatment. And that reminds me of the question that I was going to ask, which
Oh, great.
is liability and releases of info and that sort of thing. To be going out in the community and doing this in
Mm.
vivo work. What does that look like, just from a logistical kind of paperwork standpoint?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is a really good question. So, and I think we think about that, like sort of those ethical variables, no matter like if it's intensive versus if it's a non-intensive, right? Like if you're
Hmm.
doing anything where there's potential risk of being overheard, um, that uh, there's some extra complexity to that. So
Hmm.
we include that in our informed consent, and then especially when I'm having someone like a shadowing clinician or one of our practicum students or a doctoral intern that's
Hmm.
coming in for a part of the time to support. I think most families are sort of fully in support of
Hmm.
having additional people join us. And for selective mutism specifically, we need extra people to talk with. So there's really no ambiguity about other people are going to be involved in some capacity.
Gotcha.
One of the things that I think we do have to be really careful about as clinicians is it is like setting up exposures that involve novel people,
Hmm.
and not uh, helping them to understand what their role is going to be without telling anything that is not okay to say, right? So what I mean by that is, like, I couldn't go up and say, hi, I'm so grateful that you're willing to help us. My friend here has selective mutism. They need to practice talking to somebody new, right? Like, I can't do any of those types of things.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and it is like a sort of an awkward social exchange if you have a client who's not readily speaking to somebody new, or, the practice doesn't go the way that you've planned and you have to go back and do a plan B or a plan C. And there are definitely times where people will say, oh, are you family? Or, oh, wow, is this your teacher? Right. And,
Mm-hmm.
having sort of some stock statements at the ready, how to navigate those situations. Right. And
Yes.
I find, in terms of how I set those up, I normally I don't even say anything. Like, I would just go over and say, like, oh, my friend is trying to decide between ordering the chocolate ice cream or the vanilla ice cream. Would you mind asking them which one they want? And then I sort of have to shoulder some of the discomfort of, like, telling a grown up how to ask a question, and hope they don't give me too weird of looks. And then I move on with my day, and hopefully I never see them again, or they don't
Right.
remember me.
Right. Yeah, you just have to go for
Mm-hmm.
it. Get
Yeah.
over it. Gotcha.
Mm-hmm.
Gotcha. This is great. Yeah, this is fascinating. I love these sort of out of the box practice models. And
Mm-hmm.
I think it's a great option for us just to keep in mind too, for families if we might
Mm-hmm.
be working with them.
Absolutely. And again, I do some assessment, and so being able to refer people to this model, or the weekly model, or both, right? Like, being able to help families navigate what might make most sense for them.
Hmm.
And I'll give you an example of that. So we do get a lot of folks who are referred to our camp.
Hmm.
And like I said, the camp goals are a little harder and a little higher because of the nature of the group model.
Hmm.
And so there are times where we'll see on recommendations reports, like, you really need to do a camp. And that kid might not be ready for that camp. Or might not make as good of gains. And so,
Mm.
yeah, so I think it's an interesting thing to speak about, just because the research is, again, increasing in this area, and, being knowledgeable about what exists out there. But also, yeah, when we're recommending, service models for folks, having some of the background of who's going to fit and why, and what does this actually look like in practice.
Right, right. Well, that makes me think maybe we talk just a little bit more about kind of exclusionary criteria, so to speak, right? So if we're thinking
Mm-hmm.
about if we're in that situation to possibly make a referral, what who who should we maybe think twice before
Mm-hmm.
sending that direction?
Yeah, and it's so hard because I don't necessarily, like I said before, like, until you see the kid and you see how they're responding to treatment, it
Hmm.
is hard to predict
Hmm.
some of that.
Yeah.
Um, and yeah, so I think maybe the sort of synopsis is, like, lots of comorbidities. That
Mm.
might be a situation where, a 1 week intensive, I guess, just being realistic about what the aims would be, right? Like,
Hmm.
the scope of the intensive is going to be this, and this goal. We're not going to be able to tackle all of these things in this 1 week, right? And I think that that's really important for families always to know, is that this is not a curative week. Most people find that they learn a lot,
Yes.
their kid makes really good progress, they have what they need to continue to implement this as they move forward in their day-to-day lives, but it's not curative. So, sort of being able to set the right expectations. So yeah, high comorbidities would potentially be a bit of a concern.
Hmm.
So like in the camp model, because we're pairing kids or matching kids into age cohorts, if someone has, some developmental or cognitive complexities that would sort of make it so that they have difficulty in that group, and sort of like being able to meet the needs of the sort of education that we're providing in the group, like that would be potentially a concern.
Yes.
Um,
Yeah.
and certainly this is not the type of model where, parents get to sort of have a hands-off scenario, right? They're
Sure.
really immersed in this as well. And I think that's an important expectation that we would want families to have too.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. Cool. I appreciate you talking through all of this. Is there anything else, I mean, maybe that we've missed or you want to highlight before we start to wrap up?
No, I don't think so. I really like it. And I think it's really nice. I get to sort of have like mostly daytime appointments. It gives me the flexibility. And it's great
Mm,
to like not just sit in an office all day, right? Like you get to
yes.
be out about in the community and doing interesting things. I
Mm,
get to go to like museums and parks and get
mhm.
snacks that I enjoy also. So yeah, it's a really sort of fun way to spend the day by and large.
That does sound pretty good. Yeah, you get to get out in
Hmm.
the community, order some ice
Hmm.
cream, apparently.
Exactly. Lots of ice cream ordering and or other treats. That's usually one of the first exposures we do, right? Like
Sure. That's
get some
awesome.
practice talking to somebody new, get the nice natural reinforcement of ice cream cone, win-win.
It's hard to beat that. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, so it's it's
Well,
it's really awesome work.
it sounds like it. It sounds like it. Yeah, it's got me interested in it, and I appreciate just sharing all of this with us. If folks want to learn more or connect with you, ask more questions, one, are you open to that? And if so, what's the best way to get in touch with you?
Yes, definitely. So certainly, you can find me on the clinic website. Our clinic is Thriving Minds Behavioral Health. We're in Michigan. My email, is that okay to provide on here? Okay,
Yeah, if you're okay with it.
fantastic.
Yeah.
Okay. Yep. I have no problem with that. My email is K-R-E-E-D, Reed @thrivingminds.info. And another great resource, if you're interested in the SM side of things, is the Selective Mutism Association. There's some really great downloadable, printable resources there. And we have a YouTube channel as well, with some really awesome pre-recorded talks that for professionals and for families and caregivers. So really good mix of things.
That sounds great. That sounds great. Yeah, I really appreciate it, Caitlin. Thanks for coming on and talking through this somewhat unique and cool treatment approach that could be relevant for a lot of us.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. Really appreciate it.
All right, y'all. Thank you so much for tuning into this episode. Always grateful to have you here. I hope that you take away some information that you can implement in your practice and in your life. Any resources that we mentioned during the episode will be listed in the show notes, so make sure to check those out. If you like what you hear on the podcast, I would be so grateful if you left a review on iTunes or Spotify or wherever you listen to your podcasts. And if you're a practice owner or aspiring practice owner, I'd invite you to check out the Testing Psychologist mastermind groups. I have mastermind groups at every stage of practice development: beginner, intermediate, and advanced. We have homework, we have accountability, we have support, we have resources. These groups are amazing. We do a lot of work and a lot of connecting. If that sounds interesting to you, you can check out the details at thetestingpsychologist.com/consulting. You can sign up for a pre-group phone call and we will chat and figure out if a group could be a good fit for you. Thanks so much. The information contained in this podcast and on the Testing Psychologist website are intended for informational and educational purposes only. Nothing in this podcast or on the website is intended to be a substitute for professional psychological, psychiatric, or medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Please note that no doctor-patient relationship is formed here, and similarly, no supervisory or consultative relationship is formed between the host or guests of this podcast and listeners of this podcast. If you need the qualified advice of any mental health practitioner or medical provider, please seek one in your area. Similarly, if you need supervision on clinical matters, please find a supervisor with an expertise that fits your needs.